Hi there, welcome to the Upcycle Design Lab. My name's Cindy and I craft using recycled and repurposed materials. If you're new here, I hope you'll stick around and check out some of my other upcycling tutorials, and if you like what you see, you can check the subscribe button below any of my videos to become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to be notified when I upload new videos, be sure to check the bell icon as well. So today I'm going to be working on part 2 of my t-shirt quilt. If you missed the first part, you can check the link in the video corner right now. Also, I'll put links in the comment section of this video. But today we're going to be actually stabilizing the backs, working on some 2-part blocks, and trimming them down to the actual sewing size. So I should warn you, I am not a professional at all. This is my first quilt, but I'm trying to learn a lot as I go and share what I've learned and kind of take it slowly, and so far so good. So let's get on with today's video. So here's where we left off in the last video. I talked about my inspiration, how I laid out the pieces, sketched out the pieces, kept everything organized, and then did a final layout just to make sure I liked where all of the pieces were. So now we're going to go ahead and do some stabilizing of all of the knit pieces. Before we get started, here's a quick recap of the tools and materials that I will be using in this video. If you're interested, you can find links to purchase these items in the comment section of this video. So I have 2 different techniques to show you for stabilizing the knit because I kind of ended up with 2 different products accidentally. But the first process is just using fusible interfacing. So we'll start with that. So I've just got a piece of fusible interfacing cut to the size of my block, and you can feel the kind of textured side to it. That's the side that you want to touch the fabric. And of course I don't want my tag on here while I'm doing it, but I do want to keep track of my tag. So most interfacings require that you, or suggest that you use a damp cloth on top, so I'm just going to use a cloth here. And my iron's been heating up on a wool setting, and I'm just going to give it about 10 seconds. And then move to another spot. I confess I don't have the instructions for this interfacing anymore. I assume it's kind of similar to the stuff I just bought, which recommends that you do it on both sides. So I'm going to flip it over and just go through the same process again. Now I was trying to buy more fusible interfacing, but I bought it online, and unfortunately I bought the wrong stuff. What I ended up buying was Wonder Web, which some of you may already know what that is, but basically it acts as a glue between 2 fabrics. So I had to scrounge around and find a bunch of scrap fabric to use for my stabilizing fabric. Then I have the Wonder Web, which is going to glue the 2 pieces together, and my top knit piece. So again, I want to be sure to remove the tag. The only thing, I've tested this out and it seems to be holding well enough. So because of the screen print on some of these, I don't want to iron on this side of the fabric, even with my pressing cloth. So I'm just going to flip it over. Got all 3 layers here. Make sure I got everything smooth. And then I'm going to put my pressing cloth on top. And I'm just going to press on this side. And if I need to, I'll press it twice on this side, but I just don't want to put the iron too close to the screen print. So my piece is kind of cooled off. Some of the Wonder Web, if you don't cut it exactly perfectly, is going to stick a little bit, so you want to have a cloth underneath your ironing as well. Pull my pressing cloth off here. So I've got my backing fused to my front here, and the screen print looks good. Everything's holding nice and straight, and it's ready to be, this piece is ready to be trimmed down. So I just want to make sure I get my tag back on it to keep everything straight. And I'll keep working on fusing and stabilizing all my pieces. So I had a couple more thoughts to share about stabilizing the backs of the pieces here. This one is not stabilized, and this one is. You can see that it's holding the shape a lot nicer. It's not wrinkly anymore. So I just thought that was a better example to show you. But also I wanted to talk a little bit about the right side of the fabric, the wrong side of the fabric, and the direction of the fabric. So these are some of my letter blocks. And if you've pinned all of your tags to the outside of the shirt before you cut your pieces, you shouldn't have any problem telling the right side and wrong side. You can also tell just by looking at it if you know anything about fabric at all, but if you keep your tags on the right side of the fabric, you won't have any problem, because you want to be sure to put the interfacing or the wonder web and the backing on the correct side of your fabric. So that's one comment. And then the other thing you want to be sure to do is try to keep your pieces going perpendicular to the knit. So it's harder to see, but basically all that means is you want to keep your pieces going straight up and down the way they were on the t-shirt as much as possible. Another thing I wanted to mention is that after you've used the pressing cloth a few times, it does start to pick up some of the glue from both the interfacing and the wonder web. So I have, after doing several blocks, I've determined that I'm just going to press it on the back side of the piece. It seems to be holding just fine, and I'm going to be stitching this anyway, so it's not like it has to hold up through a lot of washings. It'll have some stitching on it as well. But the main reason for that is just because sometimes this adhesive kind of sticks, and it'll pull off, it won't tear anything, but you don't want to leave a mark on the correct side of your fabric. Also, in cases of running short, you can use smaller pieces to piece things together. I've had to do that in a few spots, but I have determined it's also saving some time just to do the pressing on the back of the piece and not on both sides. For this step you need a few supplies. So I actually had my cutting mat already. I don't remember how much it was. I think it was about $25 or so. And then also you need a quilter square. I'm using the 12.5-inch quilter square. I think it was $32-ish. If you use a coupon, you can get a discount on it. And you need a rotary cutter. This rotary cutter was kind of more the high end. I think it was about $35. But I've had a rotary cutter before. I didn't use it a lot because I didn't really like it that much. I've used this once, and it was very smooth and made a really nice straight cut. So I think maybe it's worth spending a little bit more money on a good rotary cutter. So like I said, this rotary cutter, I just used it one time to cut one square, but I thought I was going to need to practice a lot. I was a little bit nervous about it. I wanted to start with some of my simpler blocks. So I'm starting with a non-screen print block. I want to make sure I take my tag out of the way. And then for these 12 by 12 squares, my ruler is 12.5 by 12.5, which will give me the 1/4 inch seam allowance when I'm sewing them. So for these solid squares, it's pretty simple. You just want to make sure your squares on there pretty straight, and then I can just cut around all 4 sides. Different cutters have different ways they work. This one just has a lock button, so you can't put the blade down. So just pop it in, squeeze the handle, and your blade comes down. And like I said, I think it pays to have a nice sharp blade, but this cuts really simply. I'm just running alongside of my ruler here. So for trimming these 12 by 12 square blocks with the screen prints on them, again, it's fairly simple. You just want to make sure that your ruler is lined up. You can see through it, so you can kind of line it up with the art, make sure it's centered, make sure you've got it kind of squared off with the art. And you can see it looks like I'm going to be taking a little bit more off this side than this side, which goes back to why we wanted the excess on there. It's more important for the screen printed pieces, but you do want some excess on all of your pieces so that you are able to trim off some nice straight edges once you have the pieces stabilized. So just a couple more thoughts on the screen prints. In some cases, you may find if you're using t-shirts that you're kind of cheating a little bit when you're adding your excess. So I've got a little bit of my collar right here. I think you can see that, maybe not. So I want to be sure to trim that off when I do my final trimming. The other thing is that sometimes because you're working with the knit, you're going to get your screen prints a little bit out of skew. So you can see I have a nice straight edge here, and this kind of angles off. So when I'm trimming down my edges, I'm just going to have to kind of live with a little bit of imperfection, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I'm lining up my ruler here to be sure that I cut off the neckline, which might give me a little bit more at the bottom, but I want to make sure I'm not getting the collar in here. And you can see that this part of the screen print is angling out a little bit. So you can fiddle with it a little bit, sort of try to adjust the ruler slightly to make your screen print look as centered as possible. But like I said, there are going to be some imperfections. On a silly personal note, I have to say that I find this step very gratifying because it's really nice to have all your beautiful clean edges on your quilt squares. I have some squares left to cut, but you can see that you have a nice, I don't know, it's a little OCD I guess, but it's a fun step to do to get all your edges cleaned up on your quilt squares. I'm going to switch to trimming some of the smaller blocks now, so I just want to set aside my letter and my tag, and I'm going to use my same ruler here just to trim off a little bit to get one square corner. Kind of want to line the ruler up with the grain of the fabric, but I'm just going to trim off a little edge here. And then I want to line so I have a square corner here now, and I want to line that up with my grid on my mat. You can probably find a more professional explanation for this, but this ruler, like I said, is 12.5 by 12.5. So over here it goes just 1 inch across, and then you've got the extra 1/2 inch over here for your 1/4 inch seams, and you've got an extra 1/2 inch at the bottom here as well. So you want to make sure that you're using the edge with the extra 1/2 inch, and then you've got some markers in the middle here too. So my mark for a 6 inch square is right here. So I'm just going to line that up with the corner that I've squared off. And keep everything square here. So I'm going to trim this edge, and that'll give me a 6.5 inch by 6.5 inch block. Now this brings us to the slightly most complicated block to trim down, and those are my blocks with the screen prints that need to be 6 by 6, because I want to make sure that I'm keeping my art centered, but it's going to be a little bit of a guessing game and just sort of eyeballing it. So for the first trim, I've got it fairly centered, so I know I have roughly a 1/2 inch excess on all the sides. So I'm going to trim. I'm going to try to center my art here on the ruler, because I know I need 12 inches total. Or 12.5 once it's trimmed. So if I'm centered this direction, I should be fine for this cut. And then top and bottom is just a little bit more of a guess, but I want to trim off about a 1/2 inch on this first cut to get my square corner. So now I want to line up my square corner on my grid or on my mat. And if I've eyeballed it pretty well, my art should stay in the center. So again, I'm going to make sure I'm using the corner with the extra 1/2 inch on it. I know I need the full width of my ruler, and I want to line up on the 6 inch. I'm doing this upside down, aren't I? Oh well. 6 inch line for my art. So I'm going to add a square here. You want to be pretty precise on this step, because this will determine how tightly your corners fit together. So you can see everything's fairly centered still. Some of it is just a little bit of a guessing game with these screen prints, especially if they get stretched out or skewed at all. But just take your time and be precise. So I've finished trimming all of my quilt blocks, but before we move on, I just wanted to recap all of the Fusible products that I've been using on this quilt. So the first one is just the Fusible interfacing, and I had enough of that to use on my smaller blocks. So you can't really see it on this screen here, but you can feel the bumpier side of the Fusible interfacing, and that's the side that goes to the back of your fabric. So that fuses and stabilizes in one step. For my other stabilizing, I used the Wonder Web, which you can see is very translucent. It doesn't have any real fabric feel to it. So for that, it's also one step, but you also need some backing fabric, which I used on my bigger pieces. So I just used a lightweight woven fabric to fuse the two, the knit and the other piece of fabric together to stabilize the blocks. The last thing I used is the heat and bond, and the magic of the heat and bond is that you can do the fusing of two fabrics together in 2 steps. So unlike the Wonder Web, where you need your 2 pieces to be the same size and shape, this allows you to cut out intricate shapes and then fuse them to another piece of fabric, because it's fusible on both sides, but it also includes a piece of paper. So you do the fusing onto your smaller piece, cut it out, and then you can peel the paper off and fuse it to your next piece of fabric, which is the next step. We're going to use the heat and bond, which has already been applied to my letter blocks and my other 2-part blocks, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to fuse the pieces together. This is a 2-step process also, because the first step is to fuse the piece in place, and then you want to secure it with some stitching. So these blocks I've already finished, and they're nice and clean. The other thing I didn't mention about the heat and bond is that you don't have to seam any edges, especially if you're sewing things down and fusing them. You can just leave the raw edges, and you don't have to fold anything under. So you get some nice clean shapes, and they stay in place nice and smoothly. I'm going to be working on these 2 blocks, and like I said, I've already fused the heat and bond to the back of the letters and then cut them out. That's what allows you to stabilize and actually cut out the letters out of the knit. And we did that in the first video. But now I'm going to apply the letters to my blocks. So I just need to peel the paper off the back. You can see there's sort of a gummy layer left there. And I can just place it on my block roughly where I think I want it. And we'll take this off as well. Now I've determined that I need my blocks 1.25 inches up from the bottom. So I just have my clear ruler here, and I'm going to do one at a time just so I don't have too many things to hold in place. But I'm just going to put my ruler on the 1.25 inch line, and then I know I can just set my block on that line. The other thing I want to do is just kind of check that it's centered. So with some of the letters it's slightly more confusing than others, but here I have 1.5 inches or 2.5 inches, and here I have slightly more than that, so we'll bump it back a little bit. But you want to make sure that it looks good the way you're eyeballing it as well. So I need the center of my letter at 3.25, since my block is right now 6.5. So that's pretty close. I've got it lined up with my 1.5 inch from the bottom. And I've been heating my iron to a wool setting, so I'm just going to place it on the letter for about 6 seconds. And then I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing again. You don't want to use steam with this heat and bond. The interfacings and the Wonder Web, you generally do want to use steam and a pressing cloth. You can let it cool off and then check your edges, but we're stitching it anyway, and it looks like it's pretty well adhered. So we're going to move to the next block and just do the same process. So all of my letter blocks are 2-part blocks, but I also mentioned that I had to use some little screen prints that I couldn't cut the block out of because of where the neckline hit. So I have a couple of actual art block pieces that I want to do the same method as the letter blocks. So I have this red one that I'm going to cut this out and fuse to the center of this block. And then I've got a couple of others. that I need to do the same process with. So for this one, I was originally going to just cut it right on the black line, but I think I might leave a little bit of red edge and sew it with red thread. The letter blocks are going to be sewn with the black thread because at this point, if you're doing any two-part blocks, you want to think about how you're going to quilt the pattern and what color thread you're going to use for the actual quilting. And because I think I'm going to use some sort of contrasting threads to do the quilting, I want to make sure that these blocks have matching threads so that they are a little bit, so that they don't conflict with the quilting stitches. So for these pieces, like I said, I'm going to sew the letters in black. I'll sew this in a matching red color, and my other two-part blocks I will also match the thread color. I've decided to leave about 1/4 inch of red all the way around this. So I'm going to use my disappearing marker to mark the lines and then cut it out, and then I'll fuse it on the same way I did the letters. If you've never used these before, they come in pretty handy, especially if you want to make sure that your ink doesn't show up. When we cut the first part of this, I just used a regular marker because I knew I was going to be trimming all of it off. But this I want to be a little bit more careful with because I might not trim it exactly. So I want to make sure that my ink does disappear. So I'm just going to mark 1/4 inch all the way around. If you don't have a disappearing marker, you could use just a regular marker, but you want to make sure that you got the edge, the ink completely cut off. This just saves you from having to be quite so perfect, although you want it to be a nice clean line anyway. You can also get these markers wet. They will just disappear over time, so you don't want to mark anything that you're not going to cut right away. If you come back the next day, your line will be gone. But they also will, the ink will go away if you get the ink wet at all. So that's another way you can test to make sure that the ink will not damage the fabric that you're working on. So I just need to grab my scissors, cut this out, and then fuse it on the same way, centering it on my red block the way I did the letter blocks. So I've got my machine threaded with some black thread to match my letters, and I'm just going to carefully and slowly stitch about 1/16 inch from the edge all the way around. And when I get to my corners, I'm actually just going to use the hand wheel and slowly sew those by hand, basically, because if you're a really good sewer, maybe you can make these curves while the machine's just going on its own speed. But when I get to these parts right here, I'm going to actually just turn the wheel by hand to make these corners and curves. Just lifting the presser foot and turning it slightly, and then I'm using my hand to make a stitch, turning it a little more, just making sure I'm catching some of the black thread on every stitch. Do some more straight stitch. So you just want to work very slowly on this part of the process. The other thing you want to do is you want to be sure that with the knit you're using a ballpoint needle. It kind of goes between between the weave of the knit, or rather than punching a hole through it, which is more damaging to knits than it is to woven fabrics. So they recommend ballpoint needles for any knits anytime you're sewing a knit. And now I'm back almost to where I started stitching. I just want to make sure that I go over those stitches a little bit so that I can secure the stitches at the end. So I'm just going to run over where I stitched before, and then I'll cut off the ends of my thread. So I've finished sewing all of my two-part blocks. I did actually make a couple extra two-part blocks. I added a couple more screen prints to the design, so I did make a last-minute design change. But you can see here I've stitched with the matching thread just to add the art to the blocks. And I did leave my tags on. I wanted to tag the top of the pieces just to keep it really obvious which was the top of the piece. It's fairly obvious on most of the pieces, but some of the art is a little ambiguous, so I just, for the sake of consistency, I wanted to leave the tags on the top of the piece to help when I'm ready to sew it together, which we will attempt in the next video. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you'll stay tuned for the next episode, where we will finish up some troublesome blocks and also sew the pieces together.